The body vanished before sunrise. A Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. Snow at Ashcombe Priory. The snow had begun at noon and had not stopped since, and by the time the last light drained out of the Cumbrian sky, Ashcombe Priory stood upon its hill like a ship becalmed in a white and silent sea. The lanes below had vanished. The wall that separated the kitchen garden from the home wood was no more than a long, soft ridge, and the yews along the drive wore their green so deep beneath the fall that they seemed carved from the snow itself, rather than merely dusted with it. Inside, the fires had been built high since morning, and the smell of wood smoke and beeswax polish filled the long gallery, where, one by one, the guests of Julian Faircross came down to await the ringing of the first bell. Evelyn Rourke was the earliest down, as she generally was. She stood at the tall window in the library, with her arms folded against the draught that found its way, as it always did in that room, through the gap beneath the casement, and she watched the snow fall past the black shapes of the cedars with an expression that Hobbs, entering with the decanters, privately thought did not belong on the face of a woman about to spend New Year's Eve with her family. "They say it will not let up before Thursday, miss," said Hobbs, setting down his tray with the exactness of 30 years' service. The Renfrew's boy came up on skis to say the low roads shut past Gilling Beck. "Then we are quite thoroughly marooned," said Evelyn, and there was something in the words, not quite dismay, not quite relief, that made the old butler glance at her a second time before he left the room. She was not, in the ordinary way of things, a woman given to nerves. For 11 years she had run this house, and latterly much of her uncle's correspondence besides, with a composure that Julian Faircross was fond of calling, in his dry way, worth 2 secretaries and a solicitor. But she had seen the letter that had come for him 3 days before, had seen it only because she had brought in the second post herself, and had noticed, before he snatched it from the tray with unusual sharpness, that the hand on the envelope was disguised, block capitals pressed hard enough to show through the paper. She had seen, too, the colour leave her uncle's face as he read it, and the swiftness with which he had folded it away into his waistcoat, saying only, "Nothing, my dear, a tiresome man about a picture," in a voice that convinced no one, least of all himself. By 6 o'clock, the rest of the house party had assembled in the drawing-room. Marcus Faircross, thin and overly bright about the eyes, who had arrived that afternoon in a hired car he could very evidently not afford, embracing his father with a warmth that had not been returned in kind. Gerald Whitlock, Julian's partner of 20 years in the Faircross and Whitlock Gallery in Bond Street, portly, affable, and, Evelyn thought, sweating rather more than the fire could account for. His wife Constance, elegant and watchful, who had kissed Marcus on both cheeks with a familiarity that lasted perhaps half a second too long. Mr. Andrews, the family's solicitor, correct as a folded newspaper, with his junior clerk Thomas Reed in attendance, carrying a black japanned document case that he set down beside his chair and did not, all evening, allow to leave his sight. And lastly, Miss Sophie Lindquist, a fair, quiet young woman of 26, engaged some months previously to catalogue the Priory's considerable collection of paintings, who took her sherry to the window seat and said very little, though her eyes moved often and thoughtfully toward Gerald Whitlock. It was, on the surface, precisely the gathering that Julian Faircross had intended it to be. A reconciliation of sorts between father and son, a chance for old partners to drink to 20 years of profitable association, a pleasant occasion at which a niece who had given up her own prospects to keep her uncle's house might be properly thanked. Beneath the surface, as Evelyn Rourke well understood, and as even the least perceptive of the company must have half sensed, it was something else entirely, for Julian Faircross had let it be known, with the satisfaction of a man laying down a very good hand of cards, that he intended to make 1 or 2 announcements before the old year was out, and that everyone presently under his roof had a very particular interest in hearing them. He came down at 6:30 precisely, a spare, upright man of 68, with a soldier's bearing left over from a war 40 years gone, and looked about the room at the assembled faces with an expression of such deep and private amusement that Constance Whitlock afterward told her husband she had felt, in that moment, as though she were a specimen pinned beneath glass. "Well," said Julian Faircross, warming his hands at the fire, "I am glad the snow has kept none of you away. It would have been a pity to miss it." No one asked him what "it" referred to. No one needed to. And when Hobbs came in a few minutes later to announce that a Belgian gentleman, a Monsieur Poirot, had sent up from the village inn to say that the Gilling Road was impassable, and might he presume upon the Priory's hospitality for the night, since he had been engaged to give his lecture on criminal method to the local historical society, and could now neither go forward nor back. When Hobbs announced this, Julian Faircross's face lit with something closer to delight than mere courtesy. "Poirot," he said, turning the name over. "The detective fellow? Capital. Send the car for him at once, Hobbs. No, better, send Reed with the sledge. The roads by the lodge gates will bear it. Tell him Julian Faircross would be honoured." He glanced round the room again, and this time the amusement in his face had sharpened into something with an edge to it. "It seems," he said, "that we are to have an authority on crime among us for the new year. How very convenient that will prove, I think, before the night is out." He laughed, alone, at his own remark, and went to pour himself a whisky, while behind him 5 people exchanged glances that none of them, afterward, would fully admit to having exchanged at all. Ashcombe Priory had stood upon its hill above the beck for the better part of 400 years, built first by monks who had chosen the site for its spring water and its distance from any high road, and rebuilt twice since by Faircrosses, who had made their money variously in wool, in shipping, and, in Julian's own generation, in pictures, a trade he was fond of describing as wool for the eye, and considerably more profitable. The house wore its history in every uneven floor, and every door that no longer quite hung true in its frame, and Julian, who had been born in the small blue room at the head of the stairs, and fully intended, he often said, to die in the same bed, had a countryman's proprietary affection for every stone of it, an affection that made his announcement of a public trust seem, to those who knew him only slightly, an act of great civic generosity, and, to those who knew him better, a rather more calculated species of revenge. Marcus had arrived that afternoon in a state that Evelyn, watching from the window, had recognized at once and with a sinking heart, the particular brightness of a man who has borrowed his fare against an inheritance not yet legally his, and who means, before the night is out, to secure some assurance that the borrowing was not, after all, entirely reckless. He had embraced his father in the hall, with a warmth 2 shades too vivid to be entirely comfortable, and Julian had endured it. Hobbs reported afterward to Mrs. Pruitt, the way a man endures a dentist, all patience on the outside, and Lord knows what going on beneath. "You're looking very well, father," Marcus had said, shrugging out of his coat. "The country air agrees with you. I confess I'd feared, from your last letter, that you were quite unwell. I am perfectly well, Marcus, and shall remain so, I hope, for a good many years yet, a fact which I mention not to disappoint you, but because I think it worth saying plainly, before this evening, is very much older." Julian had smiled as he said it, but the smile had not reached his eyes, and Marcus, catching the full weight of it, had said nothing further on the subject of his father's health for the remainder of the afternoon. Chapter 2. The Reading That Never Came. Hercule Poirot arrived at Ashcombe Priory a little before 8 o'clock, wrapped to the ears in a fur-collared coat that had cost, Thomas Reed privately calculated, rather more than the sledge that had carried him up from the village, and stamping snow from a pair of galoshes with the fastidious disgust of a man for whom disorder of any kind, even meteorological, was a species of personal insult. "Ah, this English snow," he said to Hobbs, permitting his coat to be taken with the air of a man conferring a favour. "It falls with no consideration whatever for the traveller. In Belgium, I assure you, the snow has better manners." He was announced, brushed, warmed, and brought into the drawing-room within the quarter hour, where Julian Faircross rose to greet him with a warmth that struck more than one observer as excessive for a man meeting a stranger. "Monsieur Poirot, this is a very great pleasure. I have read of your cases, the affair of the Grantley emeralds, and the business of the Orient train. You will forgive me if I say that your arrival tonight seems to me almost providential." "You are too kind, monsieur," said Poirot, his sharp eyes already travelling, in the space of a single unhurried sweep, over the faces in the room, over Marcus Faircross's overbright stare, over Gerald Whitlock's damp brow, over the rigid, watchful stillness of Evelyn Rourke by the window. "Though I confess I do not entirely understand in what way Providence has concerned herself with my being snowed up in your delightful country." "You will understand before the night is out," said Julian, and smiled his private smile again, and led his guest in to dinner. Poirot, settling himself at table between Constance Whitlock and Mr. Andrews, had taken the measure of the room with the swift, unobtrusive thoroughness of a man accustomed to reading a chessboard at a glance, and had noted, before the fish had even been cleared, 3 facts that he judged worth private consideration: that Marcus Faircross drank a great deal more than the occasion strictly warranted, and drank it with the particular haste of a man fortifying himself against something rather than merely enjoying it; that Gerald Whitlock, for all his geniality, had twice reached for his water-glass instead of his wine, as though his throat had gone unaccountably dry; and that Evelyn Rourke, though she spoke pleasantly enough to Mr. Andrews on her other side, had not once, in the whole course of the fish and the soup besides, allowed her eyes to rest upon her uncle for longer than the barest civility required. "You are a keen observer of pictures, I think, mademoiselle," Poirot had said to Sophie Lindquist, who sat opposite him, hoping by the remark to draw her out a little from the silence she had maintained since the soup. "I try to be, monsieur, though I find, more and more, that the pictures I am paid to look at tell me rather more about the people who have owned them than about the artists who painted them." She had said it lightly enough, but her eyes had flickered, for the briefest instant, toward the head of the table, and Poirot, who missed very little that passed across a face in his presence, had filed the glance away with the same careful attention he gave to everything else that evening. It was, by every account given afterward, an excellent dinner and a thoroughly uncomfortable one. The soup was a clear game consommé, of which Poirot, to Hobbes's private satisfaction, ate 2 full plates. The talk ranged over the war, over the wickedness of modern motor cars, over a forged Gainsborough that had lately caused a scandal in the trade, and upon which subject Gerald Whitlock held forth at rather too great a length, as though the very act of denouncing forgery might inoculate him against some suspicion of his own. Poirot listened to it all with the mild, faintly comic attentiveness of a man who understood perhaps 1 word in 3, and said almost nothing, though Evelyn Rourke, watching him across the candles, thought once or twice that his silence had the quality of a held breath rather than of incomprehension. It was over the port, when the ladies had withdrawn and the men sat on beneath the candles with the fire crackling low, that Julian Faircross made the announcement he had promised. "I shall not keep you all in suspense any longer," he said, and there was, beneath the geniality, a coldness that made even Mr. Andrews set down his glass. "Tomorrow morning, before luncheon, I intend to sign a new will. Andrews here has the document. Reed, I think, has been guarding it as though it contained the crown jewels, and in a sense, gentlemen, it does. The bulk of my estate, including the collection, will pass not to my family," his eyes rested for 1 deliberate second on his son, "but to a trust for the restoration of this house and the endowment of a public gallery to bear my name. I have my reasons, and I do not propose to explain them tonight. But I will say this much. I have lately learned certain things about the manner in which my collection has been managed these 20 years past, and I do not intend to reward dishonesty with inheritance." The silence that followed was of a very particular quality. Marcus Faircross had gone white to the lips. Gerald Whitlock's hand, reaching for the decanter, trembled visibly enough that the crystal chimed against the glass. "Julian," said Gerald, in a voice not quite his own. "I think you had better explain what you mean by that." "Tomorrow, Gerald. Tomorrow, when Andrews has the papers ready, and Monsieur Poirot, I hope, will still be snowed in among us, to lend the proceedings a certain," he smiled thinly, "authority. I find I should like a witness of unimpeachable judgment when I say what I have to say to you. Good night, gentlemen. I am for my study and my correspondence, and I do not wish to be disturbed." He rose, inclined his head with the faint mockery of a man taking a curtain call, and left them. It was the last time any of them saw him alive. Chapter 3. A Stain upon the Carpet. The scream that woke the house at 5:15 the next morning belonged to Annie, the between-maid, who had gone in to lay the study fire before the family stirred and had found the room in a condition that sent her flying down the passage in her nightgown with a shriek that brought Hobbs from his pantry, Mrs. Pruitt from the still room, and Hercule Poirot, fully dressed, for he had, as it happened, already been awake and engaged in the melancholy business of brushing snow-damp from his boots, from the small blue bedroom at the head of the stairs. The study door stood open. The lamp on the desk still burned, though grey morning light was beginning to seep round the curtains. Papers lay scattered as though swept from the desk in a struggle. A chair was overturned, and upon the pale Turkish carpet before the hearth spread a dark and terrible stain, still faintly tacky at its edges, in a pool perhaps 18 inches across, with a long smear running from it toward the window as though something or someone had been dragged. Of Julian Faircross himself there was no trace whatever. Poirot was in the room within a minute of the scream, moving Hobbs gently but firmly out of the doorway with one hand, while his eyes performed their swift cataloguing sweep. The window, latched from within, he noted, and no footprints on the sills dusting of blown snow. The door, no key in the lock on this side, though a small brass key lay upon the desk blotter. The fire, dead, unlit. The coal scuttle still full, meaning Annie had not yet begun her work when whatever had happened here occurred. And the stain itself, at which he knelt for a long moment, touching 2 careful fingers to its edge, and then, curiously, to his own tongue, an act that made Mrs. Pruitt, hovering in the doorway, give a small cry of disgust. "Do not distress yourself, madame," said Poirot mildly, rising and wiping his fingers upon his handkerchief, with an expression that Evelyn Rourke, arriving at that moment in her dressing-gown, found impossible to read. Someone must send at once for the local police. And no one at all, is to enter this room or to touch anything within it until they arrive. Hobbs, you will stand at this door. Mademoiselle, this to Evelyn, you will perhaps be good enough to discover whether your uncle's outdoor coat and boots are in their accustomed place. They were not. Nor, when the house had been roused entirely and a hasty, horrified search conducted from attic to cellar, was Julian Faircross himself to be found anywhere within the walls of Ashcombe Priory. Not in his bedroom, whose bed had not been slept in, not in the gun-room, nor the conservatory, nor the locked wine-cellar, to which only Hobbs held a key. Not, though the search was carried out with lanterns and considerable dread, in the frozen gardens, where the snow lay unbroken and virginal in every direction, save for the single set of the maid's own small footprints, leading to the side door that morning. A man had vanished from a locked room, leaving behind him only a great pool of his own blood, in a house cut off by snow from every road, and had gone, it seemed, without disturbing so much as a single flake of the white world outside. The search itself, conducted in the grey half-light of that terrible morning, had a quality that Sophie Lindquist afterward described to Poirot as worse than finding him would have been. For it was not the brisk, purposeful business of a search that expects to succeed, but a slow, dreadful creeping from room to room, each door opened with a fresh flare of hope immediately extinguished, each empty chamber somehow more frightening than the last for its very emptiness. Marcus had gone through the cellars himself, lantern in hand, calling his father's name down passages that had not echoed with a human voice in a generation, and had come up at last, with his hands black with coal dust, and his face, Mrs. Pruitt thought, the face of a man who did not know whether he hoped to find something or prayed he would not. Constance Whitlock had refused, flatly, to descend to the cellars at all, and had instead sat rigid in the morning room with Mr. Andrews, neither of them speaking, while overhead the sound of opening and closing doors went on and on, like some dreadful clockwork that would not run down. It was Thomas Reed, methodical even in his fright, who had thought to check the old dovecote and the disused chapel beyond the walled garden, wading through drifts to his knees for the privilege of finding both entirely undisturbed. And it was Gerald Whitlock who had suggested, in a voice Sophie had thought oddly strangled for a man merely proposing a sensible precaution, that the ice house at the garden's edge be searched as thoroughly as anywhere else, a suggestion that Constable Fenwick, arriving an hour later, had noted down in his own methodical hand, without, at that stage, attaching to it any particular significance whatever. By the time the household reassembled, shivering and unsuccessful, in the drawing-room where the fire had burned all morning to no comforting effect at all, it was Hobbs who voiced, in a strangled undertone to Mrs. Pruitt, that nonetheless carried the length of the hall, the thought that had by then occurred to every soul beneath that roof, and that not one of them had yet dared to say aloud, that a man does not vanish from a locked room in a house, buried under 3 feet of untouched snow, unless some other hand, belonging to someone presently warming themselves at this very fire, had helped him to it. "Curious," said Poirot to himself, standing once more before the study door, with his hands folded behind his back, and his head tilted a very little to one side, in the attitude of a man listening to music only he can hear. Curious, and, I think, exceedingly deliberate. A body does not remove itself, mes amis. Someone in this house has been extremely clever, or else someone has wished it to appear so, and that, I confess, is the more interesting question of the two. Behind him, in the cold hall, Marcus Faircross stood very still, with his hands jammed into his dressing-gown pockets, and Gerald Whitlock leaned against the newel post as though his legs would not otherwise support him, and Evelyn Rourke watched them both with an expression that gave away, to the small, sharp eyes of Hercule Poirot, considerably more than she knew. Chapter 4. The room that kept its secret Constable Fenwick, summoned by telephone before the line went down under the weight of ice on the wires, arrived on snowshoes a little after 9, accompanied by Dr. Mead, the local practitioner, both men red-faced and blowing from the 2-mile trudge from the village. Fenwick was young, conscientious, and thoroughly out of his depth, a fact he was honest enough to admit within 5 minutes of viewing the study, and it was he, in fact, who suggested, with a deference that plainly cost him something, that seeing as the foreign gentleman's a proper detective, and I'm not rightly trained for aught but poaching and drunk and disorderly, perhaps Mr. Poirot might lend a hand until the inspector can get through from Penrith. Poirot accepted the charge with grave courtesy, and immediately set the household in order, with a briskness that surprised those who had taken his moustaches and his exquisite waistcoat for evidence of a merely ornamental intelligence. The study was to be photographed by Fenwick's own small camera before anything further was disturbed. The servants were to be assembled, and their movements of the previous night established one against another, and Dr. Mead was set to examining the stain itself, a task he performed with a frown that deepened by the minute. "I don't mind telling you, Mr. Poirot," said the doctor at length, straightening from his knees beside the carpet, "that there's something not right about this. There's blood here, right enough, human blood, I'd stake my license on it, but the pattern's wrong. A man stabbed or struck bleeds where he falls and where he's dragged from. He doesn't bleed in a neat pool with clean edges like a paint tin's been upset, and there's not near enough of it, besides, for a man to have died here. A wound that let this much blood would want tending, not vanishing." "Ah," said Poirot softly, and something moved behind his eyes that might have been satisfaction. "You relieve my mind considerably, Doctor, though I fear it complicates the case a great deal more than it simplifies it. You are quite certain. Not enough blood for a fatal wound. Not by half. A man could lose this much from a cut hand, or from a nosebleed, and live to complain of the mess. Then, said Poirot, half to himself, turning slowly on his heel to survey the room once more, we are not looking, perhaps, for the scene of a murder at all, not in the way our eyes have been invited to believe. We are looking at a scene that has been arranged. Someone has painted us a picture, Dr. Mead, and painted it, I think, with considerable haste, for see here, he pointed to the smear leading toward the window. This drag mark ends against the wainscot and goes no further, as though the person making it lost either his nerve or his time. A true struggle does not compose itself so tidily. It was at this juncture that Sophie Lindquist, white-faced, asked to speak with him privately, and led him not to the study, but to the long gallery where the Priory's paintings hung in their gilt frames beneath the grey morning light, and pulled from beneath a dust sheet a small canvas, a Dutch interior, modest and unremarkable to any eye but a trained one, which she turned to the light with hands that shook. Mr. Faircross asked me to catalogue the collection properly, monsieur. Condition, provenance, the lot. 3 weeks ago I found that this one, she touched the canvas's edge, has a second signature beneath the visible one, under the varnish. It isn't what the insurance papers say it is. It's a copy, and a recent one. I found 2 more the same, after that. I told Mr. Faircross a fortnight since. He didn't seem surprised, monsieur. He said he had suspected as much of a certain gentleman for some time, and told me to say nothing further until after the New Year. She looked up. I think that's what the letter was about. The one that upset him so, 3 days ago. And the certain gentleman, mademoiselle, did he name him? Sophie Lindquist did not answer at once, but her eyes, when at last she spoke, went unmistakably toward the door, through which, faintly, they could hear Gerald Whitlock's voice, raised in some protest to Constable Fenwick. He didn't need to, she said quietly. The gallery ledgers are kept in Mr. Whitlock's hand alone. No one else has ever had access to them. If the collection has been robbed of its originals and fitted out with copies, monsieur, there is only one man who could have managed it without my noticing these 3 years past. Earlier that same morning, before ever he had climbed to the long gallery, Poirot had spoken also, briefly, with young Annie, the between-maid whose scream had begun the whole dreadful business, and had found her still trembling so violently over her sewing in the servants' hall that Mrs. Pruitt had been obliged to sit beside her, with an arm about her shoulders throughout the interview. I don't know what I saw, sir, only that I've never in my life seen the like, and never wish to again. The room all anyhow, and that stain, sir, so dark against the light carpet, and the lamp still burning as though nobody had thought to put it out, which nobody ever does forget, not in this house, not with Mr. Faircross so particular about the coal bills. She had twisted her apron in her fingers. I went in to lay the fire, same as always, 5 o'clock sharp, and I don't remember screaming, sir, only that the next I knew, Mr. Hobbs had hold of my arm and was asking was I hurt, and I couldn't tell him nothing sensible at all. You are quite certain the door was locked when you came to it, mademoiselle? Not forced, not standing ajar already, but locked as it should be, and opened by your own key? Locked, same as every morning, sir. I've the household keys on my own ring, same as I've carried them 2 years past, and I turned it same as always, not thinking nothing of it, and then, she had shuddered, and Mrs. Pruitt had patted her shoulder, and given Poirot a look that plainly asked whether he had not, by now, tormented the poor child quite sufficiently for one morning. He had bowed, thanked her with real gentleness, and withdrawn, carrying with him one further small certainty to add to the others he was quietly assembling, that whatever had happened in that study, it had happened, and been finished, well before 5 o'clock, and behind a door that had been most carefully and deliberately locked again afterward. Now, in the gallery, Poirot regarded Sophie Lindquist for a long moment, his head tilted again in that listening attitude, and then bowed very slightly. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You have given me, I think, the second half of a story whose first half I have already begun to suspect. But a motive for murder, however excellent, is not itself a murder, and I remind myself that we have not yet even established that a murder has, in fact, taken place. A man is missing. A great deal of blood has been very carefully arranged to look worse than it is. These are two separate mysteries, perhaps, wearing the costume of one, and it will not do, mademoiselle, to dress the second in the clothes of the first before we are certain which is which. Chapter 5. The Sledge, the Snow, and the Sundial. By 11 o'clock, the snow had, for the moment, ceased to fall, and Poirot took the opportunity to walk the grounds himself, wrapped in a borrowed ulster 2 sizes too large for him, and picking his way with distaste along the path that Hobbs had cleared to the outbuildings. He had asked, before setting out, one question of Mrs. Pruitt that had made the housekeeper blink. "Madam, I wish to know whether this house possesses any means of passage that is not, so to speak, upon the ordinary plan of the architect. A priest's hole, a smuggler's way, an old passage of the kind your English houses of a certain age are so fond of concealing." "There's talk of such a thing, sir," Mrs. Pruitt admitted, "though I've been housekeeper here 19 years and never seen it myself. Old Mr. Faircross's father used to say there was a way from the study through to the ice house, from smuggling days, when the Priory took brandy up from the coast. Hobbs might know more. He's Priory born, same as his father before him." Hobbs, questioned in his pantry, admitted the existence of the passage with obvious reluctance, and greater reluctance still to Poirot's next question as to whether Mr. Faircross had ever had occasion to use it lately. "I'll not lie to you, sir, seeing as a man's missing and blood's been spilt," said the old butler at last, twisting his hands together. "But I gave my word, and I don't break it easy. Your word to a man who may now be dead, Hobbs, is a debt best paid by helping to find him, or to find who has done this thing, if thing has indeed been done. I ask you again, has that passage been opened recently?" Hobbs's silence lasted the better part of a minute, and when he spoke at last, his voice had dropped almost to a whisper. "3 nights back, sir. Mr. Faircross had me clear the leaves and rubbish from the passage door behind the study bookcase. Hadn't been opened in years. The hinges wanted oiling something dreadful. He said," Hobbs swallowed, "he said he might have need of it, and that I wasn't to speak of it to a living soul. Master's orders. I thought no more of it than an old man's fancy, sir. Begging your pardon. I never dreamed." "No," said Poirot gently. "One rarely does dream of the things that come to pass. Show me this passage, Hobbs, if you please. At once." The bookcase swung on a concealed pivot with a groan of protest, revealing a narrow stair of worn stone descending into darkness that smelled of earth and old brandy casks, and Poirot, candle in hand, went down it, with Hobbs trembling at his shoulder, and Constable Fenwick, greatly excited, close behind. Hobbs had told him, as they waited for a second candle to be fetched, something of the passage's history, how his own grandfather, coachman here in the old squire's time, had told tales of it being cut wider once, in smuggling days, than it now ran, before a fall of stone had narrowed the middle stretch to the crouching passage they saw before them now. How the last certain use anyone in living memory could recall was some 50 years past, when the present Mr. Faircross's own father, then a boy, was said to have hidden in it for the better part of a day after some boyish mischief, and been found at last, filthy and unrepentant, by a search party that had very nearly given him up for lost down the old mill race instead. "It's queer, sir, to think of it opened up again after all these years, and for such a purpose," Hobbs had said, his candle trembling very slightly in his hand. "Master used to tell that story of his own father hiding down here as a great joke against himself, sir. The Faircrosses have always had a talent for disappearing when it suited them," he'd say, and laugh. I don't believe he ever thought, saying it, that the joke would come home to roost quite so terribly, sir, as it seems to have done. The passage ran, low and cramped, a good 60 yards beneath the east lawn, before opening into the small stone ice house at the garden's edge, a building whose door, Fenwick, established with some triumph, stood unlocked, though the padlock hasp had not been forced, but merely left unfastened. Within the passage itself, some 20 yards from the study end, Poirot's candle showed them a scuffing of the dust and grime upon the floor that spoke unmistakably of some disturbance, and, caught upon a splinter of the rough stone wall, a single thread of dark blue wool that Poirot detached with the greatest care and held to the candle flame, turning it this way and that with an expression of profound and settled satisfaction, as a man might regard the final piece of a puzzle long anticipated. "Blue wool," he murmured. "A common enough colour, Hobbs, for a common enough sort of overcoat. But I think, when we have finished this morning's work, that we shall know rather better than we do now to whom this particular thread belongs, and why a passage sealed for years should suddenly, 3 nights before a man vanished from a locked room, have needed its hinges oiled." The ice house itself yielded nothing further, no body, no further trace, only the packed sawdust and the great grey blocks of lake ice stored against the summer, and Poirot stood a long moment upon its threshold, looking out over the unbroken snow of the lawn toward the black windows of the sleeping house, before turning back with the air of a man who has, for the present, learned all that this particular chamber has to teach him. "The passage explains the vanishing," he said to Fenwick as they climbed back toward the daylight. "It does not yet explain the blood, which the good doctor tells us is too little and too tidy for a death. Nor does it tell us whether Monsieur Faircross walked this passage of his own will, or was carried through it, living or otherwise, by another. We have solved, I think, the how of the conjuring trick. We have not yet begun upon the why, nor upon whose hand performed it." Chapter 6. Small Questions, Smaller Lies. Poirot conducted his interviews that afternoon in the library, with its tall windows full of grey snowlight and its smell of leather and cold ash, and he conducted them, as Evelyn Rourke observed with some surprise, less like a policeman than like a physician taking a series of quiet, careful pulses. Marcus Faircross came first, restless and combative, twisting his signet ring round and round upon his finger as he spoke. "I don't see what business it is of yours, or the constable's either, where I was at midnight. I was in my room, alone. I'd had rather too much of my father's port, if you must know, and rather too much of my father's company beforehand, and I went up and I stayed up, and if you're waiting for me to say I crept down and murdered him, you'll wait a long while, because whatever else is true, I loved the old devil, whatever he thought of me." "No one has suggested murder yet, monsieur," said Poirot mildly. "I ask only where you were. You say alone. Can anyone confirm this?" "At midnight? In a house where everyone had gone to bed? Of course not." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You'll be wanting to know about the money next." "Very well. Yes, I owe a great deal of it to a great many people, and yes, my father's new will would have left me with nothing but the courtesy title and my own wits, which God knows have never kept me in cigarettes, let alone in the style my creditors expect. But a man does not murder his father over money he'd have inherited in the ordinary way of things eventually, monsieur. He waits. It is a great deal simpler and a great deal less trouble with the law. A cynical philosophy, monsieur, but not, I think, altogether without its logic," said Poirot, and made a small note. But he did not, quite, let the young man go. "One thing further, monsieur, before you leave me. You say you loved your father, whatever he thought of you, and yet I am told, you will forgive me, these things come to me from a dozen directions in a house such as this, that there was some sharpness between you at dinner, 2 nights before this one, over a matter of a horse, or a wager, or some such thing, that ended with your father leaving the table before the pudding was brought in." Marcus flushed. "It was nothing, a disagreement about money, as it generally was between us. He said some things I didn't care for, and I said some things I dare say he didn't care for either, and we neither of us meant the half of it, as fathers and sons very rarely do." He paused, and something in his bravado faltered, just perceptibly. "I'd have made it up with him, monsieur, given time. I always did in the end. I only wish now that I'd had rather more time than I was given." "Time, monsieur. said Poirot, not unkindly, is very rarely as generous with us as we assume it will be, which is why I make it my business, in my own small trade, never to assume it at all. And this time he did let him go. Gerald Whitlock, when his turn came, perspired freely and answered a great many questions that had not, strictly, been asked of him, a habit Poirot noted with the mild, attentive pleasure of a fisherman watching a fish investigate the bait. I was with my wife the whole evening, from the moment we retired. You may ask her. I know what's being said below stairs, Poirot, and I won't pretend I don't. That Julian had found something amiss in the ledgers, that I'd reason to wish him silenced. It's monstrous. It's a slander on 20 years of honest partnership. Yes, there have been irregularities, shall we say, in one or two attributions, but the trade is not an exact science, whatever these young cataloguers with their varnish and their ultraviolet lamps would have you believe. Mademoiselle Lindquist did not accuse you of anything, monsieur, said Poirot gently. I have not yet mentioned her name. Gerald Whitlock's face, already flushed, went a deeper and more unhappy colour, and for a moment he said nothing at all. You need not answer further today, said Poirot at last, not unkindly, but I would advise you, monsieur, that the truth, however uncomfortable, generally proves less troublesome in the end than its alternative. Constance Whitlock confirmed her husband's alibi with a smoothness that struck Poirot as very slightly rehearsed, and volunteered, with an air of reluctant candour that he found considerably less convincing than her rehearsal, the information that she had, once or twice, observed Marcus Faircross and Evelyn Rourke in what she called a rather particular sort of understanding, an observation Poirot received with a polite inclination of the head and set down, mentally, in the file he was already keeping marked herrings, red, of doubtful freshness. Evelyn Rourke, when she came to him last of the family, was pale, but entirely composed, and answered his questions with a directness that he found, after the afternoon's evasions, almost restful. I was in the study myself, monsieur, at perhaps 11:30. I took my uncle his hot milk, as I did every night of my life these 11 years. He was writing letters. He seemed, not afraid precisely, but keyed up, like a man before an examination he is confident of passing. He told me to go to bed, and not to worry myself. I did not see him again. And you are engaged, mademoiselle, to Mr. Andrews's clerk, this Monsieur Reed. The colour came into her face at last. How did you— She stopped herself. Yes, we had not told my uncle. He did not think a solicitor's clerk a fitting match, and I did not wish to distress him before I had to. If you are asking whether that gives me reason to have wished him dead, monsieur, you may ask it plainly. The answer is no. Whatever the will said, I should have married Thomas regardless, and my uncle knew it, in the end, whatever he pretended. Poirot studied her for a long moment with his bright, unblinking eyes. I believe you, mademoiselle, he said at last, which is not, I fear, quite the same thing as believing you have told me everything you know. Chapter 7. The Ledger and the Locked Drawer. It was Thomas Reed, summoned last and least willingly, who provided Poirot with the afternoon's most concrete harvest. The young clerk was pale, precise, and plainly terrified, less, Poirot judged within a minute of beginning, for himself than for Evelyn Rourke, whose name he brought into every second sentence with the anxious care of a man walking on ice he does not trust. Mr. Andrews will tell you I was with him from 10 o'clock, going over the draft will line by line, in his room, until gone 1 in the morning. Mr. Faircross wished it finished, and beyond dispute by breakfast. I did not leave that room, monsieur, save once, a little after midnight, to fetch a fair copy of the trust deed from the document case, which I had left in the hall. And in fetching it, monsieur, did you observe anything, anyone, upon the stairs, in the passages, at that hour? Reed hesitated, and the hesitation was, to Poirot's practised eye, worth a great deal more than the answer that eventually followed it. I thought I heard the study door, monsieur, opening or closing, I could not say which, and a voice, Lo, I couldn't make out words, only that there were two of them talking, or one talking and one very much not wishing to be overheard doing so. I didn't investigate. It was not my place, and Mr. Faircross had made it very plain he wished no one to disturb him. You did not think it worth mentioning this morning, when a man was found to have vanished from that very room? I have thought of nothing else since, monsieur, said Reed with sudden unhappy honesty, and I have been trying all day to decide whether telling you serves any purpose beyond frightening people who may have done nothing worse than pass a wakeful hour in a house where sleep, that night, cannot have come easily to anyone. Poirot let this pass without comment, and turned instead to the black japanned document case that Reed had guarded so faithfully through a day of chaos, and asked, with the air of a man raising quite a different subject, whether the case had ever, in the 24 hours since the family's arrival, been left unattended. Only the once, monsieur. Last night, when I went down to fetch the fair copy, I left the case itself in Mr. Andrews's room, locked, and the key on my own watch chain the whole while. It cannot have been tampered with. I did not suggest that it had been, said Poirot, though I thank you for assuring me of it so completely and so promptly, Monsieur Reed, which is nearly always, in my experience, a sign that a witness has already asked himself the very question I have not yet troubled to put to him. He turned next to Mr. Andrews and asked to see, if the solicitor would be so good, both the old will presently in force and the new draft that had never, now, been signed. And it was in comparing the two documents, laid side by side upon the library table beneath the grey window light, that Poirot's expression underwent its first real change all that long day. A narrowing of the eyes, a stillness about the mouth, as of a man who has found, in a column of figures he had thought merely dull, one number very much out of place. Monsieur Andrews, he said slowly, this schedule of the collection appended to the new draft, the valuations here are given in Mademoiselle Lindquist's own hand, I think, from her recent survey? They are, Monsieur Poirot. Mr. Faircross insisted the new trust deed carry an accurate independent valuation, rather than the figures the gallery itself had always supplied. And these figures, said Poirot softly, laying one finger upon a line near the foot of the page, differ very considerably, do they not, monsieur, from the figures carried these 20 years past in Mr. Whitlock's own gallery ledgers, which I understand Mademoiselle Lindquist has also lately had occasion to examine. Mr. Andrews, following the pointing finger, went very quiet indeed. I had not connected the two documents, Monsieur Poirot, but now that you mention it, no, they do not agree at all, not by some several £1,000, and not, I think, by accident. Very little in this house, monsieur, said Poirot, folding the papers together with great care, has happened, I begin to believe, entirely by accident. Chapter 8. A Portrait Half Finished. That evening, with the snow beginning again against the windows and Constable Fenwick gone back down to the village to telephone what news he could to Penrith, Poirot walked once more into the long gallery, where Sophie Lindquist sat alone before an easel on which rested, half cleaned of its yellowed varnish, a small dark portrait of a stern-faced man in 17th-century dress. "You work late, mademoiselle. For a house in mourning it has not yet been permitted to properly begin. It gives me something to do with my hands, monsieur, that is not simply waiting to be told my uncle's employer, I beg your pardon, my uncle's business partner, has been arrested, or has not, or that Mr. Faircross has been found, or has not." She set down her brush with a small, unsteady laugh. "I don't know why I still call him my uncle's partner. Force of habit. Mr. Faircross always spoke of him so, my old partner Whitlock, as though they were still the young men who founded the gallery together, before either of them had learned to distrust the other. When did the distrust begin, mademoiselle, in your observation?" She considered this seriously, turning her brush between her fingers. I think it was the Dutch interior, monsieur, the little one I showed you this morning. Mr. Faircross asked me, very casually, to look particularly closely at that one canvas, before I had found anything wrong with any of the others, as though he already suspected and wanted an independent eye to confirm it, before he confronted Mr. Whitlock himself. That was 5 weeks ago. I have wondered since whether that was truly the moment his suspicion began, or only the moment he decided to act upon a suspicion very much older. And in 5 weeks, mademoiselle, he said nothing to Monsieur Whitlock directly, made no accusation, brought no reckoning? Not that I know of, monsieur. I think he was a man who liked to be entirely certain before he struck, and liked, besides, to choose his own moment for the striking. I think last night, and this morning, and the new will, were to have been that moment. I think he meant it, in its way, as rather a piece of theatre, the whole house gathered, the will read out, and then, before we had all recovered our breath, the ledgers produced, and Mr. Whitlock named before witnesses he could not afterward pretend had misunderstood him. Poirot was silent for a moment, looking not at her, but at the half-cleaned portrait upon her easel, at the stern painted face emerging by degrees from beneath its century of grime. "A piece of theatre," he repeated softly. "Yes, I think you have put your finger, mademoiselle, upon something a great deal more important than you know. Tell me, in your survey of this collection, have you had occasion to examine the storerooms below stairs? The place where damaged canvases or frames awaiting repair, or, forgive me, I ask from simple curiosity, theatrical properties might be kept, if this house had ever, in some past generation, been given to amateur dramatics?" Sophie Lindquist blinked at the change of subject. "There's an old store off the servants' hall, monsieur, full of exactly that sort of lumber. I believe the Faircrosses did put on plays here, years ago, for the village. Mrs. Pruitt has mentioned it once or twice, quite fondly. She says Mr. Faircross himself was rather celebrated for it, as a young man, played the villain in something or other 3 years running, and was so convincing, she says, that old Mrs. Renfrew in the village refused to serve him at the shop counter for a fortnight after, quite forgetting it had only been a play. Why do you ask?" Poirot's eyes had brightened at this small piece of local history with an interest that seemed, to Sophie, wholly disproportionate to its apparent triviality. "A celebrated villain, mademoiselle, and convincing enough to frighten a shopkeeper out of her wits. That is a very interesting thing to learn of a man now missing from a room decorated, shall we say, with rather too artistic an eye for horror. It tells me that Monsieur Faircross possessed not only the motive and the opportunity to arrange such a scene, but also, from his youth, a certain relish for the arranging of it, a taste for theatre that a lesser man, lacking his particular vanity, might never have thought to indulge at so grave a moment in his own life. "Because, mademoiselle," said Poirot, rising and settling his waistcoat with the small, precise movement that in him denoted the arrival of an idea he did not yet wish to speak aloud, "I begin to suspect that Monsieur Faircross was not the only person in this house inclined, upon occasion, toward theatre, and that the performance given in his study 2 nights past may have had a cast of more than one, playing, I fear, from 2 entirely different scripts, neither actor aware how completely the other's lines would come to alter his own." Chapter 9. The storeroom off the servants' hall. The storeroom, when Poirot had Hobbs unlock it for him the following morning, proved exactly as Sophie Lindquist had described it. A low, cluttered chamber, smelling of dust and mouse and old canvas, hung about with broken picture frames, a moth-eaten set of curtains from some Edwardian refurbishment, and, pushed into a corner, beneath a grey sheet, a small trunk marked in faded paint, Ashcombe Dramatic Society, 1911. Within it, among programmes gone brown with age and a quantity of paste jewellery, Poirot found what he had, by his own quiet admission to Fenwick, come very particularly to look for. 2 small brown bottles, their labels half peeled away, of the kind theatrical suppliers had for decades sold under the name of stage blood. 1 bottle nearly full, the other, when Poirot held it to the light and turned it in his fingers, unmistakably and recently opened, its rubber stopper still soft and pliable where its fellows had perished to brittle dust. "Dr. Mead was correct in every particular," said Poirot, half to himself, half to the constable at his shoulder. "The stain upon the study carpet was never a man's death, Fenwick. It was a performance, and a performance, moreover, prepared some little time in advance, by someone with knowledge of this trunk and license to visit this room unremarked. Tell me, who among this household might come and go from the servants' quarters without comment? Any of the family, sir, in the general way, though it's not a place they'd ordinarily trouble themselves to visit. But the servants, of course, and Miss Rourke, being as she runs the house. And Monsieur Faircross himself, I think, above all, said Poirot slowly, who was Priory-born, as Hobbes is Priory-born, and who would have played, perhaps, in these very theatricals as a young man, and would know exactly where an old trunk of stage properties might still be found, 40 years on, by a man who required them urgently and did not wish to ask a servant's help in the finding. He straightened, the empty bottle held delicately between finger and thumb, and there came into his face, for the first time since his arrival at Ashcombe Priory, an expression that was not merely thoughtful, but something closer to sorrow. I begin to believe, Fenwick, that we have been hunting the wrong crime from the very first hour. Somewhere in this house, I think, a foolish and a brave old man laid a trap of his own devising, and somewhere in that same house, another person, moving upon a purpose entirely separate from his, walked into the middle of it in the dark, not knowing it was there at all, and turned a piece of theatre into something the leading actor had never rehearsed and could not, in the end, survive. Beneath the bottles, folded with a neatness that struck Poirot as significant in itself, lay a single sheet of the Priory's own writing paper, upon which, in a hand he now recognized at once as Julian Faircross's own, for he had seen enough of it, these 2 days, among the scattered correspondence of the study, was set down a short, careful list: bottle, chair to overturn, papers to scatter, not too neat, key on blotter, not in lock, passage, mind the third stair, it creaks. It was, Poirot thought, turning the paper over in his hands, a document of almost childlike thoroughness, the stage directions of a man who had rehearsed his own disappearance with the same meticulous care he had brought, 40 years before, and by all accounts with considerable success, to the amateur theatricals of his youth, and it told Poirot, more eloquently than any witness yet had, precisely what manner of man Julian Faircross had been: clever, controlled, faintly vain of his own cleverness, and entirely unprepared, for all his careful planning, for the one variable no stage direction could ever govern, the presence, in the dark garden he had chosen for his private theatre, of another man playing an entirely different and infinitely less rehearsed part. He wrote himself instructions, Fenwick, said Poirot softly, as a man writes instructions for a servant, or a general for his officers before a battle, and I confess, I find something in it both admirable and unbearably sad. He trusted his own cunning so completely that it did not once occur to him to ask what might happen if some other player, uninvited and unrehearsed, wandered onto his stage in the dark. It was at this juncture that Mrs. Pruitt, white and trembling, appeared in the storeroom doorway to say that Hobbes, of 30 years' unimpeachable service, had shut himself in his pantry and would speak, he said, to no one in the house but the foreign gentleman, and would speak to him at once. "He's been that way since breakfast, sir," she added, wringing her apron between her hands. "Wouldn't touch his tea, wouldn't answer me civil, which isn't like him. Not in 30 years has Hobbes been short with me, whatever else has gone wrong in this house. I don't like it, sir. I don't like it at all." Chapter 10. The Housekeeper's Confession. And the butler's Hobbes was sitting very upright in his pantry chair when Poirot came to him, his hands folded before him on the scrubbed table, with the stillness of a man who has decided, after long resistance, upon a course and does not now intend to be moved from it. "I've not slept, sir, since it happened, nor eaten neither, and Mrs. Pruitt tells me I look like a man walking to his own hanging, which is very likely how I feel, though God knows I've done nothing this house need be ashamed of me for, only I gave my word, and I've broken it now, in my own mind, 20 times over since yesterday morning, wondering should I speak or shouldn't I, and I find I cannot carry it alone another hour." "Tell me, Hobbes," said Poirot gently, seating himself opposite, From the beginning, I think I have already guessed the greater part of it, but I would hear it from you, in your own words, for a guess, however confident, is not evidence, and you, I believe, can give me both. It was 3 nights back, sir, as I told you of the passage, but I didn't tell you the whole. Mr. Faircross called me to him after that letter came, the one that frightened him so, and he says to me, "Hobbs," he says, "I believe someone in this house means me serious harm, and I mean to find out who, and I mean to do it in my own way, without the police coming down and frightening the game before I've had my shot at it." He'd always been a one for his own way, sir, all his life, and he tells me his plan, that on the last night of the year, after he'd made his announcements and shown his hand, so to speak, to whoever it was he suspected, he'd make it seem he'd come to harm in his study, a bit of the old stage blood from the dramatic trunk, that he remembered well enough from his own young days treading the boards for the village, and then slip away through the old passage into the ice-house, and from there round by the shrubbery, back into the house by the garden door, and hide himself close by, watching, to see who came creeping to that study once the alarm was raised, and what they did there, thinking themselves unobserved. And you helped him prepare this scheme, Hobbs? I did, sir. God forgive me. I oiled the passage hinges, same as I told you. I fetched him the bottle from the storeroom myself, not 3 days since, and never thought to ask myself was it wise, only that he was my master, and had asked it of me plain, and I'd have cut off my hand sooner than refuse him anything in this world. The old man's composure broke at last, and his folded hands trembled upon the table. But I never saw him after midnight that night, sir. I was to wait for him at the garden door at 1 o'clock, to let him in, quiet-like, and I waited, sir, near on an hour in the cold, and he never came. I went to bed at last, thinking he'd changed his plan, or thought better of it, or maybe gone to ground somewhere I wasn't told of. He didn't tell me everything, sir, only enough to help him, and it wasn't till Annie screamed in the morning that I understood something had gone dreadfully wrong, and I've sat with it ever since, sir, not knowing whether by helping him I'd help to kill him. Poirot sat a long while in silence, his eyes upon the old butler's bowed grey head, and when he spoke at last, his voice had in it a gentleness that surprised even Mrs. Pruitt, listening unashamedly at the pantry door. You did not kill him, Hobbs, whatever guilt you have carried these 2 days. A man who lays a trap for a wolf is not to blame if the wolf, finding the trap already sprung, does murder in the dark regardless. You have given me, I think, the last piece I required to understand the shape of this business entire, and I thank you for it, and I tell you now, so that you may sleep this night at least a little easier, that the fault you have been carrying belongs, in its whole and proper weight, to another person altogether. Chapter 11. Footprints in the Wrong Snow. Armed now with the full shape of Julian Faircross's scheme, Poirot went out once more into the white and silent gardens, this time with a purpose so exact that Fenwick, following at his heels with a lantern, though the day was bright, found himself hard put to keep pace. He meant to conceal himself close by the garden door, to watch who came, Poirot said, half to the constable, half to the cold morning air, which means, Fenwick, that he did not, after all, mean to remain within the passage or the ice-house the whole night through. He meant to come out into the garden itself, into the shrubbery Hobbs spoke of, from which a man might watch the study window. That window there, you observe, which looks directly upon this stretch of lawn, without himself being seen from the house. The snow of 2 nights past had been trampled since by a dozen searching feet, but at the shrubbery's edge, beneath the black shelter of an old yew whose branches had kept the ground beneath them nearly bare, Poirot went down upon his knees in the cold, with no regard whatever for his beautifully creased trousers, and after some minutes of the closest examination, gave a small, satisfied exclamation. Here, Fenwick, look, the impression of a man's boot, and a second beside it, overtreading the first, as a man does who stands long in one place, shifting his weight against the cold. And here, he pointed to a second, fainter track, leading not from the ice-house, but from the direction of the side lawn, where the household's own bedrooms look down, a second person, coming not from within the passage at all, but from the house itself, by the ordinary door, to this same spot, beneath this same tree. Two of them, sir, meeting here, in secret, in the middle of the night. I think, Fenwick, that Monsieur Faircross, concealed here to watch his study window, was himself observed in turn, by someone who had reason to be abroad in the garden that night for a purpose of their own, and who came upon him unexpectedly in the dark, hiding like a burglar in his own shrubbery, and who put together, faster perhaps than Monsieur Faircross would have wished, some part at least of what he was about. He rose, brushing snow from his knees with fastidious distaste, and looked back toward the dark bulk of the ice-house. Come, I think it is time, Fenwick, that we examined that building a second time, and a great deal more thoroughly than the first, not for a passage this time, but for a hiding place. A man does not stand an hour in the freezing dark beneath a yew tree without, at some point, needing to withdraw somewhere less exposed, and the ice-house, which he had already made use of once that night, would surely have suggested itself to him as the nearest and most natural refuge. Fenwick, to his credit, did not flinch from the task, though his young face had gone the colour of the snow itself, and he worked alongside Poirot in a silence broken only by the scrape of their boots and the small, dry rustle of frozen bracken disturbed at the ice-house door. The building was colder within than the garden without, a deep, still, mineral cold that seemed to belong to no particular season, and their breath hung about them in clouds as they searched, methodically, along each wall in turn. "It's a wretched business, sir, if you don't mind my saying so," Fenwick offered at last, his voice unnaturally loud in that close, muffled dark. "I joined the constabulary to keep order at the market and see drunk men home of a Saturday, sir, not for this. I keep thinking of Mr. Faircross as I saw him only 2 evenings back, large as life, pouring out the port and laughing fit to burst at his own joke about the detective come among us. It doesn't seem right, somehow, that a man can go from that to this in the space of 1 dark hour." "It very rarely does, Fenwick," said Poirot gently, without pausing in his careful examination of the stonework, "and I have long since given up expecting that it should. That is, I think, the one lesson this profession teaches most reliably and most cruelly to any man who practices it with his eyes truly open, that the distance between a man laughing over his port and a man lying cold and forgotten is a very much shorter distance than any of us like to believe, and that it is crossed, more often than we care to admit, not by villains of the storybook kind, but by ordinary, frightened people acting very much out of character in the space of a single unrehearsed minute. They found it within 20 minutes, not in the main chamber where the ice itself was stored, but in a low side chamber, once used, Hobbs later explained, for the storing of game before it went to the larder, its door so nearly the colour of the surrounding stone that Fenwick had walked past it twice on the previous day without a second glance. And within that chamber, laid upon a bed of old sacking with a care that spoke, unmistakably, of hands that had not wished to cause further hurt, lay the body of Julian Faircross, quite dead these 2 days past, a single dreadful wound to the back of the skull, explaining, at last and beyond all further theatre, precisely what Dr. Mead's careful eye had told him from the very first, that whatever performance had been enacted in the study, the true and final act of this tragedy had been played out somewhere altogether darker, and had needed no stage blood at all. Chapter 12. What the doctor's second look revealed. Dr. Mead's examination of the body, conducted within the hour in the cold light of the ice-house's outer chamber, with a grimness that had replaced his earlier, half-professional curiosity entirely, yielded conclusions that Poirot received without visible surprise, as a man receives the confirmation of a sum he has already, privately, worked out upon paper. Death was not instantaneous, Mr. Poirot, but it was quick, a single blow, delivered with considerable force from behind, and a little above, by some smooth, heavy object, rather than a blade or a firearm. There's bruising at the shoulder besides, as though he'd been gripped, and perhaps struggled before the blow fell. I'd say 2 days dead, near enough, which puts his death at some hour of that first night, and not, whatever the study led us to believe, at any later time. And the wound itself, Doctor, does it suggest to you a blow struck by a man prepared beforehand to kill, or a blow struck in the heat and panic of a moment neither party had anticipated? Dr. Mead considered this with the seriousness it deserved. If you're asking whether this was planned, Mr. Poirot, I'd say not. Not this particular act, at any rate. A planned killing generally comes with a chosen weapon, brought for the purpose. This has the mark of something snatched up in the dark, in a passage or a cramped space, by a person taken entirely by surprise and lashing out before thought could stop the hand. It's an ugly wound, and a fatal one, but I'd not call it, from the wound alone, the work of a man who came out that night meaning murder. There is one thing further, Doctor, that puzzles me a little, Poirot went on, indicating the careful arrangement of the sacking beneath the body. This is not how a guilty man conceals evidence of his crime in panic and haste. See how the sacking has been folded, almost tenderly, beneath the head and shoulders, as though whoever placed him here could not bear to leave him lying upon the bare stone, even in the act of hiding what he had done. That is not the gesture of a hardened murderer, Doctor, covering his tracks. It is the gesture of a man in an agony of remorse, trying, in the only way left open to him, to make some small and useless amends. Dr. Mead considered the arrangement with fresh attention and nodded slowly. You may be right, Mr. Poirot. I've seen a good deal of violent death in 30 years of country practice, one way and another, and I'll own I've rarely seen a body hidden with quite this much. I don't know what to call it, sir, but tenderness seems the only word that fits, however strange it sounds applied to such a business. It is not strange at all, Doctor, when one has seen as many crimes of passion and panic as I have, and as few crimes of pure and calculated wickedness. Most murderers, in my experience, are not monsters at all, but ordinary men and women who have been driven, by fear or desperation, to a single dreadful act they would give a great deal, afterward, to undo. And it is that very desire to undo what cannot be undone that so often betrays them in the end, in some small foolish tenderness like this, however carefully they may have covered every other trace. That, said Poirot slowly, rising from his crouch beside the sacking with the particular stiffness of a small man who has spent too long upon cold stone, accords very precisely, Doctor, with the shape this case has been assuming in my mind since Hobbs spoke to me an hour since. We have, I think, 2 men abroad that night, with 2 entirely separate purposes, one carrying a bottle of stage blood and a scheme to catch a thief, the other carrying, I very much suspect, no weapon at all, but only a guilty conscience and a very great fear of what the morning's will signing would bring. And the 2 purposes met, in the dark, in a narrow stone passage neither man had expected the other to be using, and what followed was neither theatre nor premeditated murder, but something a great deal more commonplace and a great deal more tragic. 2 frightened men, in the dark, each mistaking the other for a danger, and one of them, in the confusion, striking a blow he can never, now, take back. He looked out through the low doorway toward the white, indifferent garden, and for a moment something moved in his face that was very close to genuine sorrow. Monsieur Faircross set his trap with great cunning, Fenwick, and sprang it, in the end, upon no one but himself. That is, I think, the cruelest of all the ironies this sad case has yet shown me, and I do not believe, when we come to it, that it will prove to be the last. Chapter 13. The Blue Thread and the Blue Overcoat. With the body found, and Dr. Mead's findings set down in his careful notebook, Poirot's remaining task, as he explained to a badly shaken Constable Fenwick over a hurried lunch neither man had much appetite for, was no longer to determine what had happened, but who, and here, he said, the thread of blue wool taken from the passage wall would very likely serve him better than a dozen further interviews. A common colour, I said when first I found it, Fenwick, and so it is. But common is not the same as universal, and a house full of guests dressed for a country New Year does not offer so very many blue overcoats as you might suppose. Come, let us discover, with Hobbes's help, precisely who among this household owns such a garment, and, this is the more interesting question, who among them can account for its whereabouts on the night in question. It was a small inquiry, conducted with tact and without accusation, and it yielded its answer within the half-hour. Marcus Faircross owned a blue overcoat, but had left it, by his own cheerful admission and Mrs. Pruitt's confirmation, hanging in the cloakroom the entire evening, being a young man who felt the cold a good deal less than his years in London might have suggested. Mr. Andrews's coat was grey. Thomas Reed owned no overcoat at all, beyond the black one he had arrived in. It was Gerald Whitlock whose travelling coat, a good, heavy, dark blue Melton, bought new that autumn in Bond Street, as Constance mentioned without thinking, before the significance of the question had fully reached her, proved, upon examination by Poirot himself in the cloakroom, to be missing a small quantity of wool from its lower left sleeve, torn, as the frayed threads plainly showed, quite recently, and by catching against something rough. Constance Whitlock, summoned to confirm the coat as her husband's own, had done so readily enough, and had watched Poirot's examination of the torn sleeve with an expression that shifted, over the course of perhaps 30 seconds, from polite bewilderment to a dawning ashen comprehension that she was, evidently, at considerable pains to master before it could fully show itself upon her face. "It is an ordinary tear, monsieur," she had said at last, a little too quickly. "Gerald is forever catching his sleeves on one thing or another. Brambles, gates, the wretched holly by the stable door. I shouldn't think it means anything whatever." "Perhaps not, madame," Poirot had answered, with a gentleness that somehow made the words a great deal more alarming than any sharper tone could have managed. "Though I find that where a man has caught his sleeve is very often quite as instructive as that he has caught it at all. Brambles and gates and holly, madame, do not generally grow within a stone passage 60 yards beneath a lawn, and it is precisely there, upon the rough wall of that passage, that this same thread was found." She had said nothing further, and had left the cloakroom with a stiffness in her bearing that told Poirot, more plainly than any words, that whatever comfortable ignorance she had maintained until that moment regarding her husband's movements on the night in question, had, in the space of those few sentences, been very thoroughly and very painfully dispelled. "It is not proof of murder, monsieur," Poirot said to Fenwick afterward, turning the coat over in his hands with something almost like regret. "A torn sleeve is a torn sleeve, and juries have hanged no man upon so slight a thing, nor should they. But it is, I think, the last small stone required to complete the wall I have been building these 2 days past, and I believe the time has come to invite our entire company to the library this evening, and to build that wall before them, stone by stone, until only one man is left standing behind it." Chapter 14. A Trap Baited with Truth. Poirot arranged the gathering for 8 o'clock, after a dinner eaten by all in a silence so complete that even the striking of the hall clock seemed an intrusion, and when the household assembled once more in the library, Marcus pale and quiet now, all his earlier bravado spent, Constance sitting very upright with her hand upon her husband's sleeve, Evelyn beside Thomas Reed, their fingers laced together without pretence, for the first time in the whole sad business, Mr. Andrews grave behind his spectacles, Sophie Lindquist near the cold hearth, her eyes moving, as they had moved from the first, toward Gerald Whitlock. Poirot stood before them all, with his hands folded neatly at his waist, and began, as he generally did, at what appeared to be the beginning, though those who knew him best would have told you he had, in fact, already reached the end, some hours before. "I must tell you first," he said, "that the man you have all, these 2 days, believed murdered in his study was not murdered there at all. There was no crime committed in that room whatever, only a very clever piece of theatre, prepared and performed by Monsieur Faircross himself, with a bottle of stage blood, some 40 years old, and the willing, unhappy help of a servant who loved him a great deal better than he perhaps deserved to be so trusted. He told them then, without embellishment, the whole of Julian Faircross's scheme, the threatening letter, the secret restoration of the old passage, the plan to fake his own death and watch, unseen, to discover which of his household would come, in the confusion, to search his study and betray by that searching a guilt he had not yet been able to prove. He told them of the ice house and the storeroom trunk and the single thread of blue wool caught upon the passage wall. He hid himself, that first night, beneath the yew tree at the shrubbery's edge, to watch this very window. Poirot indicated it with a small gesture. And there, in the dark, he was in turn observed by another person abroad in the garden that night for reasons of their own, a person who came upon him unexpectedly, in circumstances that must have seemed, in that black and freezing hour, entirely sinister and entirely alarming. Two frightened men, mes amis, meeting where neither expected to find the other. One of them believing himself, perhaps, discovered in some guilty errand of his own, the other believing himself, perhaps, set upon by the very enemy he had come out to catch. And in the passage, in the dark, in the confusion of that meeting, a blow was struck, not planned, not premeditated, but no less fatal for that. And Julian Faircross, who had built so clever a trap to catch a thief, walked into the middle of it himself, and did not come out again alive. The silence in the library had become, by now, a silence of a very particular quality. The silence, Poirot thought, watching the faces before him, of people who have each privately understood, in the same instant, precisely where this account must lead, and are waiting, with dread and a kind of terrible relief both, to hear it said aloud at last. Sophie Lindquist had gone very still upon her chair near the cold hearth, her hands folded tight in her lap, and it seemed to her, listening, that the whole slow, careful architecture of the past 2 days, the interviews, the passage, the storeroom, the footprints in the snow, had been leading, all along, toward this single moment in this candle-lit room, as inevitably as a chord resolves at last to its root. She had known, she realized now, from the morning she had first shown Poirot the little Dutch canvas with its false signature beneath the true one, that the truth, when it came, would come to rest somewhere very near where her own eyes had already unwillingly travelled, and she found herself gripping the arm of her chair as though the room itself had begun, very slightly, to tilt. Mademoiselle Lindquist, said Poirot gently, discovered some weeks ago that 3 canvases in this collection, catalogued and insured as originals, are in fact recent and accomplished copies, a discovery she reported, as was her plain duty, to Monsieur Faircross, who had, I believe, already begun privately to suspect as much. The gallery ledgers recording the collection's valuation and provenance these 20 years past have been kept in one hand alone, and one hand only, and it is that same hand, I think, whose overcoat now hangs in the cloakroom of this house, missing a small tuft of blue wool, torn against the rough stone of a passage its owner had no business whatever being found within. Chapter 15. The Gathering in the Library. Gerald Whitlock had gone, in the course of Poirot's recital, from red to grey, to a colour that had no proper name at all, and when at last the detective's small, unblinking eyes came to rest upon him directly, he made no attempt whatever to rise, or to protest, or to summon the bluster with which he had met every question of the 2 days past. He sat quite still, his hands loose in his lap, and when he spoke, his voice had none of its former heartiness left in it. "I never meant it," he said. "I want that understood, before anything else is said in this room. I never went out that night meaning harm to any living soul. I went out because I could not sleep, and could not sleep because I knew what tomorrow's will reading would mean for me, whatever Julian chose to call it in front of witnesses. Ruin, prison, very likely, if he pressed the matter as far as I believed he meant to. I walked in the garden because 4 walls had become unbearable to me, and I came upon a shape, in the dark, beneath the yew, and it moved, and it seized my arm, and God forgive me, I thought. I don't know what I thought. That I was discovered, that someone had been sent to silence me before I could be exposed. I struck out. I didn't even know, in that first moment, who it was I'd struck. It was only when he fell, and I lit a match with hands that would hardly hold it, that I saw, that I understood. His voice broke entirely, and it was some moments before he could continue. I panicked. God help me. I thought if his body were found, in the garden, struck down, every eye in this house would come to me before morning was out, whatever else might be said. I remembered the old passage. Julian had mentioned it to me once, years ago, in an idle hour, half as a joke about his family's smuggling forebears, and I found the ice-house door standing open, though I didn't understand then why it should be, and I carried him there, and hid him, and told myself, God forgive me, that I would find some way, in the morning, to explain it, to make it right, and instead, the morning came, and there was blood in the study, and a locked door, and a vanished man, and I understood no more than any of you what had truly happened, only that whatever mystery the house now believed itself facing, I dared not be the one to unravel it, for fear of what unraveling it must show. For a long moment no one in the library spoke. Then Marcus Faircross, of all people, rose half out of his chair, his face working with an emotion that surprised even himself. "You let us all go on believing," he began, and stopped, and mastered himself with a visible effort. "I sat at breakfast, Whitlock, and watched you eat a boiled egg, as though nothing in this world troubled you, while my father lay dead in that ice-house, not 200 yards from where we sat." "I know it," said Gerald Whitlock, without looking up. "I have known it every hour since, and I do not ask you to forgive me for it, for I have not forgiven myself, and do not expect to, whatever a court may decide." Sophie Lindquist, by the cold hearth, found that her own eyes had filled with tears she had not expected, and could not entirely account for. Grief, she thought, not for the fraud she had uncovered, nor even, quite, for Julian Faircross himself, whom she had known only a few short months, but for the sheer, ordinary, avoidable waste of the whole affair. 20 years of partnership, a man's whole careful cleverness, a household's fragile New Year peace, all of it undone in a single dark minute that need never, with a little more honesty on one side and a little less pride on the other, have come to pass at all. "You did not stage the blood in the study, monsieur," said Poirot, when the silence that followed this had stretched long enough. "That much, at least, was never any doing of yours, and I have known it from very nearly the first hour of this inquiry, for the stain was too tidy, too carefully placed, and too poor in quantity to have come from any true wound. It was Monsieur Faircross's own hand that arranged it, hours before you ever met him in that garden, as the opening move of a game he did not live to finish playing. You have carried, these 2 days, the guilt of a vanishing you did not create, alongside the far graver guilt of a death you did, and I think, monsieur, that in your fear of the first, you have very nearly persuaded this household, and might in time have persuaded a jury, that you were entirely innocent of both. It was, in its way, almost as clever a piece of theatre as your late partner's own, though I do not think, somehow, that you meant it so. Chapter 16. The Anatomy of a Vanishing. The snow had begun, at last, to thin by the time Constable Fenwick led Gerald Whitlock out to the small room where he would be kept, under guard, until the Penrith inspector could at last force his way through the drifts. And it was very late that night. The fires burned low, and the house settling at last into something like an exhausted peace, that Hercule Poirot sat a while with Evelyn Rourke in the library, before the embers, and permitted himself, for the first time since his arrival, to speak not as an investigator, but as a man who had watched a sad and foolish and very human tragedy play itself out to its end. "He was not a wicked man, your uncle," said Poirot at last. "Foolish, perhaps, in the particular way that clever men are so often foolish, believing that because he could outwit a fellow man across a desk or a ledger, he could outwit him also in the dark, in a game of his own devising, without pausing to consider that the dark makes fools and cowards of us all, however carefully we have rehearsed our parts. He built his trap with great cunning, mademoiselle, and sprang it upon no one in the world but himself, and I confess I find very little in this whole sad affair to smile at, though I have solved, I think, every riddle it set me. And Mr. Whitlock? Evelyn asked quietly. Was there always this in him, do you think, underneath the 20 years of partnership and good fellowship? Or did fear simply make of him, that one night, something he had never truly been before? That, mademoiselle, is a question no detective's little grey cells can answer for you, for it belongs to the province of the priest and the philosopher rather than the investigator. I will say only this, that fear is the great revealer of what a man has always, secretly, been capable of, and never yet been tested to become, and that Monsieur Whitlock's crime, if crime it must be called, was not planned in cold blood at any desk, but born entire, in a single terrible instant, out of 20 years of small and patient dishonesties that had, by that night, left him no honest way out of the corner into which he had painted himself. Your uncle sought a thief, mademoiselle, and found, in the darkness he had chosen for his hunting ground, not a thief but a frightened man, capable, under sufficient pressure, of the one crime he had never intended and could never afterward undo. It is, I think, the oldest lesson that my profession has to teach, and the one I find myself obliged to relearn, a little sadly, with every case that falls to me, that the traps we lay for others have a habit, in this imperfect world, of closing upon whatever hand chances to find them first, guilty or innocent, deserving or otherwise, and rarely trouble themselves to ask our permission first. He rose, at last, and bowed to her with the old-fashioned courtesy that had, over 2 strange days, become entirely familiar to the house. The roads will be clear by morning, I think, mademoiselle, and I have a lecture in the village still owing, though I confess criminal method must seem, after these 2 days, a rather dry subject beside the reality of it. I wish you and Monsieur Reed every happiness the new year can be persuaded to offer you. You have earned it, I think, rather more than most, having kept faith with a difficult man and told me the truth, both, when a great many easier paths lay open to you. On his way up to bed, Poirot paused a moment at the door of the butler's pantry, where a thin line of lamplight still showed beneath the door, and found Hobbs sitting exactly as he had left him that morning, though his hands, at least, had ceased their trembling. "You will not sleep easily for some while yet, I think, Hobbs," Poirot said gently. "But I would have you know that Constable Fenwick has already told the inspector, arriving tonight from Penrith, that you came forward of your own free will, and told the whole truth unasked, when a lesser man might have held his tongue and let suspicion fall where it would. That counts for a very great deal. In the reckoning such matters are eventually given, and I think your late master, wherever his soul has gone to its rest, would tell you so himself if he could. He was a good master to me, sir, whatever foolishness he got himself into at the end," said Hobbs quietly. 30 years I served him, and I'll serve his memory a good deal longer than that, I shouldn't wonder, doing right by this house as he'd have wished it done by. Then you will do it a great deal better, I think, for having told the truth today, than you would have done carrying its weight in silence for the rest of your years," said Poirot, and left him to his lamp and his long thoughts, and climbed the last flight of stairs to his own small blue-papered room, where, before he slept, he stood some minutes at the window looking out over the quiet, moon-washed snow of the garden, at the black shape of the yew tree and the low grey roof of the ice-house beyond it, and thought, not for the first time in a long career, built upon the small vanities and larger sorrows of his fellow men, how very rarely the cleverest plans of the cleverest people accounted for the one thing that no amount of little grey cells could ever quite predict, the frightened, fallible heart of another human being, moving in the dark toward purposes entirely its own. And with that, Hercule Poirot took himself off to bed, leaving Evelyn Rourke alone before the dying fire, to keep, a little while longer, her own quiet watch over the strange and sorrowful house that had, in 2 days and 2 nights, given up at last every secret it had tried so hard and so uselessly to keep. The end.